Good evening. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout tonight despite terrible weather. And I know Professor Eberly is jealous of all of you. As a political junkie, he is doing this despite the fact he cannot track the Virginia gubernatorial results as they come in. So, yeah, you might have to keep him apprised during the Q&A of where things stand. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker tonight. Professor Eberly is a key member of the political science department. And not only that, but this is not his first or second book that he's published during his time at St. Mary's, but his third book in a relatively short amount of time. To put that in context, I had to write this down, all the things that he's done while working on these three books. He's coordinated the public policy major. He led the Center for the Study of Democracy. He's been chair of the political science department, and he maintains a popular blog on Maryland and national politics. That's not all. He's also a popular and highly sought-after professor. His classes fill up quickly, and he won the Student Government Association's Faculty Student Award in 2010. You have probably also seen him, heard him, or read him in the Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, National Public Radio, or some other outlet. He is omnipresent. He is a public intellectual in the best sense of the word. And that brings us to tonight's topic. So he has written a book that couldn't be more timely. In some ways it doesn't even require an introduction, but I'm going to give it one anyway. Because, you know, if you give professors a chance to speak, that's what they do. So this book, which he's co-authored with Steve Shire, who he's worked with on a number of other publications, discusses the Trump presidency in a dispassionate and scholarly manner. And yes, it is possible to discuss President Trump in a dispassionate manner. It's somewhat shocking. I was particularly struck by Professor Eberly's emphasis on the context in which President Trump finds himself and the degree to which that is going to shape his presidency. And I suspect he will touch much more on that, getting beyond a lot of the superficial and tweet level elements to some really key elements reflecting policy. So I had this plan that tonight I was going to introduce him by reading some reviews of the book from Amazon. I was enormously disappointed. So a couple things you need to know. First, there are only 10 copies of the book left on Amazon, so go out and get it now before they run out. They claim they're more on the way for the holidays. But, you know, get it now while you're sure. And write a review, because now it's just political science professors, influential scholars. You need to get in there, write reviews, and you know, the word of the people, right, in all of this. So, without further ado, the person we actually came here to see speak, who will tell you much more about this fascinating book that he's written, Professor Eberly.
Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you for coming. I especially appreciate the fact that you've come here on a night like this. It's cold, it's wet, it's dreary, and more importantly, there's a series of elections taking place in the state just across the river that, I don't know about you, but I'm obsessed with seeing how it turns out. About 30 seconds ago, with 11.4% of precincts reporting, it was 49.9% Gillespie, 49.0% Northam. Just to keep you apprised of where things are. That's about the only update I'm going to see for an hour. There are a couple of things that I'd just like to say, maybe at the beginning as a way of introducing this book. I want to make clear, you know, when we wrote this book, we understood that Donald Trump was an incredibly polarizing figure. There aren't a lot of people who occupy that middle ground of, well, you know, gee, I'm just not sure how I feel about the fella. Folks either tend to love him or they tend to despise him, and there's not a lot in between. And if you go right now to buy books on the 2016 election or books on President Trump, unfortunately what you're going to find are books that are written to either praise him or to pillory him. And as far as I'm concerned, it's really just a lot of partisan noise that doesn't inform us in any meaningful way. So our goal with this book was to try to cut through the partisan noise. The partisan noise that we heard all throughout the 2016 campaign that tended to ignore a lot of political science, a lot of the context about how elections happen, why elections turn out the way they do, and the fact that in America we actually have some discernible and clear patterns of the shift from one party to another in our elections. And since he has become president, And to no small extent by the fact that he is a very controversial and confrontational fellow, much of the coverage of him over the course of the past year has been equally very noisy and very polarized. If you seek solace in the Huffington Post and MSNBC on a nightly basis, you can hear people telling you that he should be impeached. It's crazy that he hasn't been impeached yet. If, on the other hand, you take your solace from Breitbart or from Fox News, you're essentially hearing that he's been an incredibly successful president and the press simply won't give him any real credibility for what he's done. And again, this isn't really telling us the story of the Trump presidency. It's not telling us the story of the election, why it happened, or what his first year in office has been like. And that's the other thing that I wanted to focus on, what we wanted to focus on in this book. Donald Trump may have run against the establishment. He may have been the quintessential outsider. But he still has to govern as president from within the establishment that he ran against. The institutions, be they the courts, the bureaucracy, the Congress, or the institution of the presidency, are larger than any one person, which means the context of those institutions and of that office in a historical context will matter. There is no person, no president, I would argue, great enough to overcome the institutional context, the weight of 220 years of precedent in the United States. So we wanted to put this in a little bit of context. I'll share with you quickly the preface of our book, which you don't need to read. I actually just encourage you buy the book. It's much easier to read on the printed page than projected up here. We say that no president has taken the oath of office with as little experience in government as Donald Trump. The quintessential outsider candidate, he boasted a long career as a celebrity billionaire who exhibited brash language and behavior. Trump had never run or held elective office or served in government before. 2016, however, proved to be a uniquely promising moment for an outsider like Trump to challenge established political elites of both parties. His general election opponent was an insider, seemingly sent from central casting. Former Secretary of State, New York Senator, First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton was the establishment. Trump, the billionaire, managed to become the choice of working class voters by channeling their anger and their resentment towards the system. Voters wanted an outsider in the Oval Office, and that was never going to be Clinton. 9 months in, his presidency has been marred by missed opportunities in Congress, some setbacks in the courts, low popularity, and ongoing personnel drama. Thus far, he has raised a very important question, and that question is, can an outsider govern? So that gives you the context for our book. But before I get started, I want to point out a few things that I think are sort of crucial to understand about 2016. First, I'm going to stand here and tell you that contrary to the popular narrative, the polls did not get it wrong in 2016. In fact, the polls in 2016 were more accurate than they were in 2012. Let me tell you why. What you're looking at up here, and I apologize if you can't see it very clearly, is the average of polls as put together by RealClearPolitics.com, and if you don't use RealClearPolitics.com on a regular basis, you should. It is perfect for political junkies. But it's the running average of all of the national polls on Election Day in 2016. On Election Day 2016, Hillary Clinton had a lead in the national polls of 3.3 percentage points. She won the popular vote by 2.1 percentage points. To put that into context, in 2012, on Election Day, Barack Obama had a lead in the national polls of 0.9%. He won by 3.9 percentage points. The polls were actually closer to the final outcome in 2016 than they were in 2012. In key states like Pennsylvania, well, on Election Day, the average of polls in Pennsylvania put Hillary Clinton ahead by 1.9 percentage points. In the end, Donald Trump won by 1 percentage point. That is completely within the normal margin of error of any poll. The polls did not get this wrong. In key states like Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, the polls had this race, statistically speaking, tied. Donald Trump happened to win most of those very close states. What you're looking at here, this map, is the Electoral College map is put forward on Election Day by Real Clear Politics. What they did was they said, let's take all these polls, no matter how close they are, if someone has a lead, even if it's 0.1% is their lead, we're simply going to say that person wins the state. On Election Day, Real Clear Politics had this race, if you assign states in that way, essentially tied. 272 for Clinton, 266 for Trump. You shift one state, and Trump has won. Now, if you look at this map, what you would discover is, of the 50 states plus the District of Columbia, so the 51 areas from which we get electoral votes, this map has 47 of the 51 correct. In the end, Nevada went to Clinton. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which were very close, went to Trump. The polls did not get it wrong. The polls showed exactly what we had, a very close race, a race that was so close that we saw a split between the Electoral College and the popular vote. One person won the popular vote, the other person won really the only number that mattered, the Electoral College. It was a close race, and the polls saw that really down to the wire. So if the polls didn't fail, what did fail? My argument is that in 2016, punditry failed. Punditry failed because we, in fact, decided to ignore political science, ignore the lessons of past elections, and we got caught up in a groupthink that told us only one outcome was possible. We looked into that election, and ignoring everything else, just decided Trump was too controversial, too unqualified, too unpopular, had done too many things wrong to possibly win, regardless of the fact that it was a close race in the polls. We ignored many political science models that have been in place for decades that look at things other than just opinion polls. They look at the country's mood with regard to the strength of the economy. They look at ratings of whether or not the country is moving in the right direction or the wrong direction. They look at the approval rating of the incumbent president, and perhaps more importantly, they consider whether or not the party in power has been in power for 2 consecutive terms. The political science models actually told us this was a close race or the Republican had a slight advantage. We ignored that because of all the other reasons we had convinced ourselves that Trump wouldn't win. We ignored some other key evidence. In the closing week of the campaign, in that generic ballot between Republicans and Democrats, which party would you vote for in Congress? Republicans overtook Democrats in the final week of that campaign. You wouldn't expect to see that in a year where Hillary Clinton was going to win comfortably. We just sort of glossed over it. We ignored that there was an incredibly large number of undecideds, and the rule of undecideds is they almost always break for the party out of power. Didn't matter. We were convinced that this is how it was going to turn out. What we needed was a much more thoughtful analysis and less loud punditry. We got the loud punditry. And what we have seen in the year since the election took place is just a continuation of loud punditry. In many respects, this book is also written as sort of a plea to remember political science, to remember to put things into context. And that's certainly what we're hoping to do. So we want to cut through the partisan noise, explore the historic context of Trump's campaign and his presidency, offer an assessment of how things have gone, why he won, and even look at the likelihood of success grounded in what we know from past presidents. Because again, even though he may have been an unprecedented candidate, even though he may have been an unconventional candidate, that doesn't mean that he's going to be able to sort of break free of the weight of the office or free of the experience of prior presidents. So that's what we're looking at. We always knew that his transition from a controversial and confrontational candidate into president was going to be a difficult transition, and I think that we have seen over the course of the last 9 months that he has still not quite mastered that transition from confrontational candidate into governing president. All right. So, There's only so much of this book that I can cover, only so much of your time I can ask you to give and still allow some time for questions. So I'm going to focus on two elements of the book. One, I'm going to focus on our examination of the 2016 election and how it is that Trump won and why maybe we shouldn't have been surprised by the outcome even though we were. And then I'm going to focus on Trump as president working with Congress over the course of his first year in office, trying to achieve that elusive, significant legislative victory that all presidents strive for in their first year in office. And once I'm done with that, I'll open it up for questions. I have never given a talk on one of my own books before, so I apologize if I talk too much. But to quote my esteemed colleague, give a professor an opportunity to talk, and we're going to do it. All right? Okay. So here's the question. How did a billionaire, reality TV star, with no political experience, and a campaign that was in a seeming state of constant chaos, defeat one of the most experienced, well-known, and well-funded political dynasties in America? And in fact, not one of, but two of the most well-known, well-funded political dynasties in America, if you include how easily he dispatched Jeb Bush as a challenger in the Republican primary. There are no shortage of theories, but it's worth considering the possibility that the outcome of the election in 2016 was actually a bit conventional and predictable, even though it featured a very unconventional and unpredictable campaign. And let me explain to you why I would argue it was actually a rather predictable or conventional outcome. In recent decades in America, and in fact around the world, we have witnessed a collapse of confidence in government and recurrent populist uprisings in our nation. We can go back, just for the sake of tonight, only as far as 1992 and the Ross Perot candidacy. We can look at the Republican Revolution of 1994, the Democratic sweeps of 2006, and even the election of Obama in 2008 of evidence of populist uprisings in America, including even the Republican resurgence that took place in 2010. These populist uprisings don't have a partisan label that goes with them. Rather, they reflect national examples of a frustrated electorate lashing out at a system that they think has forgotten them. Trump's victory, and I would argue the strength of Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary, was just another manifestation of the populist uprisings that we see recurring throughout American political history, especially in the last 30 years. The populist uprising argument can find some solace in exit polls, and again, I apologize if these aren't clear to you, but I'm going to tell you what they say. On Election Day 2016, fully 69% of voters were either dissatisfied with or angry at government. Dissatisfied with or angry at government. Trump won 58% of those voters. A plurality of voters, 48%, wanted the next president to be more conservative than Barack Obama. As you might expect, Trump won 83% of those folks. A clear plurality, 39%, said that the quality that mattered most to them in a new president was that he or she could bring change. Trump won 83% of those voters as well. Fully half of all voters said that government already does too much as opposed to too little, and Trump won 3/4 of those voters on Election Day. Given her resume, Hillary Clinton really had no choice but to run as the establishment candidate. In the midst of all of that populist ire and voter anger against the system, she ran as the candidate of President Obama's third term. She wrapped herself in the cloak of his agenda. She did all of this in a year when voters clearly said they didn't want the establishment to win. Neither candidate was viewed as honest or likable, and most voters were not happy with the choice they were presented with in 2016. In what I consider to be a rather telling finding, fully 60% of all voters on Election Day said Donald Trump was not qualified to be president. He won 20% of the folks who said he wasn't qualified to be president. The 2016 election was an election based on discontent and frustration, not qualifications and temperament. and the data was there to tell us that before Election Day. If I could continue in this strain, on Election Day, over 2/3 of the electorate were either dissatisfied or angry at the federal government. Nearly 2/3 of the electorate said that the American economy was in poor shape and that the country was headed in the wrong direction. Trump carried those voters by a wide margin. Those feelings of discontent and the margins by which Trump won were in fact incredibly similar to the numbers we saw in 2008 that helped Barack Obama defeat John McCain at the end of 2 terms of George W. Bush. And now if I can sort of delve into a little bit of controversy, why not? Even arguments that exogenous events like James Comey's October surprise a week before the election, where he released that letter to Congress indicating that there was going to be a reopening of the FBI's examination of Clinton's email server, even the suggestion that that caused Clinton the election, as many people believe, doesn't actually hold up to close scrutiny. And the polls help us understand why. Again, what you're looking at in the yellow line is Hillary Clinton's average lead in the national polls in the days leading up to the election. The yellow line is what really matters for us here. And what you see is in the 2 weeks prior to Comey releasing that letter, Clinton had enjoyed up to a 6-point lead over Trump in the national polls. Now, some have argued that that lead collapsed in the days following the Comey letter. This graph actually shows that that's not the case. What happened was we were looking at polls based on when they were released, not polls based on when they were actually in the field and people were being asked their choice. The gray line indicates polls when they were released, showing the lag time. If you look at the polls when they were in the field, and you look at when the Comey letter was released on the 28th, something should become very, very clear to you. Hillary Clinton's lead had already collapsed before James Comey ever issued that letter on the 28th. It was already gone, which makes it hard to make the case that Comey's letter caused it, unless somehow a lot of people knew the letter was coming. Her numbers actually began to rebound very quickly in the days immediately following the issuance of the letter, the opposite of what you would expect if that letter is what caused it. So the question would then be asked, why did her numbers fall like that after being in a lead of up to 6 points? Well, the explanation can be found in a factor that actually helps play into this popular discontent argument. The fall actually took place right after a widely reported story regarding double-digit premium hikes under the Affordable Care Act. Increases in premiums that were going to be roughly 22% across the nation, and in certain areas like in Phoenix, Arizona, a key swing state, they were looking at premiums on the Affordable Care Act individual market of 145%. This widely reported story comes right before the decline in her lead, and it plays perfectly into an election cycle in which people were upset with and angry at the establishment and at government. It actually provides a much better explanation for why her lead fell than does the release of the letter by FBI Director Comey. No real extraordinary factors needed, just politics. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the assumptions that were made about the Democrats' blue wall and this idea that there were states that were just guaranteed to go to the Democratic Party because of changing demographics in America. We addressed this as well in the book. Back in 2002, which for all of the students probably seems like an entire lifetime ago, but to some of us seems like maybe yesterday. Back in 2002, a very influential book was published titled The Emerging Democratic Majority. And the book made the argument, in fact made a very compelling case, that Democrats were on the verge of establishing a lock on the Electoral College, becoming undefeatable in the presidency. And this was going to be driven by demographic changes taking place in metropolitan regions, home to the growing minority and professional populations essential to the Democratic Party. As argued by the authors, the emerging majority required one other crucial member, the white working class. It was going to be a coalition of white professionals minorities, and the white working class. Though the white working class had been moving away from the Democratic Party, especially starting with Reagan, the authors made the argument that white working class voters were coming to reject social conservatism as being put forward by the Republican Party, and that they were reverting to their prior preference for the economic policies of Democrats. When you looked at the Democratic Party's gains in 2006, Barack Obama's victory in 2008, his re-election in 2012, the authors very much believed that they had seen their emerging Democratic majority emerge. But Donald Trump's victory actually lays bare a lot of the flaws in the emerging majority theory. Trump won an overwhelming majority of white working class voters. In the key battleground states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Trump actually saw the Republican margin among white working class voters grow from 12 points in 2012 with Romney over Obama to 30 points in 2016. His margin more than doubled. Trump defied expectations as well among other groups central to the emerging majority theory. He carried college-educated whites and suburban voters. He received the support of 61% of white working class women, a group that was assumed would vote for Hillary Clinton. He split the votes of married women with Hillary Clinton, and though he lost Hispanic and black voters by wide margins, Donald Trump received more support among black and Hispanic voters in 2016 than Mitt Romney had in 2012. This runs completely counter to what the expectations of the emerging majority theory held. Clinton's advantage, even among young voters, was far less than what Obama's had been in 2012. All of these key groups were not performing in the way the emerging majority theory would have us believe. In hindsight, it's actually clear that the potential for an emergent Democratic majority had been overstated. But the error, I think, goes beyond just misreading how key demographic groups would vote. The Democratic Party's coalition, you see, is concentrated in large metropolitan regions, and that limits the party's ability to win in an electoral system that is determined more by geography than it is by demography. And make no mistake, we elect presidents based on geography, the Electoral College. At present, geography favors Republicans, and it certainly favored Trump in 2016. To put this into a little bit of context, in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the largest metropolitan areas in the United States by an historic margin of 30 points, the largest margin by which a Democrat had won metropolitan regions. So her margins added to her popular vote total, but most of those large metropolitan regions were located in states that were already Democratic, which means it added to her popular vote total, but not her electoral vote total. Clinton not only lost in small cities and towns in rural America, she performed worse than has any recent Democrat. So let's compare her to the last Democrat who won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College, Al Gore, in 2000. Back in 2000, Al Gore won the popular vote by about 550,000 votes, but he lost the election by 4 electoral votes. A very close election. Like Clinton, Gore won in the largest metropolitan areas, but lost in small cities and towns. However, the gap for Gore between his level of support in those metropolitan areas and his level of support in rural America was roughly 18 percentage points. Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million votes, lost the Electoral College by 72 votes, but her gap between her support in metropolitan areas and in rural America was 32 percentage points, nearly double what it had been for Al Gore. She simply could not overcome that to win the Electoral College. So most of what I've just said for all of you from the book paints a relatively good picture for why Donald Trump won. You don't have to believe that it was James Comey. You don't have to believe that it was Russian interference. It was Donald Trump tapping into where much of the electorate was in 2016. Now comes the part that people who voted for Trump might not like as much, but the book isn't sort of written to make anybody particularly happy. I think it's important to note that just because Trump's victory was unexpected, it was not necessarily very impressive in a historical context. So consider, Trump was actually the weakest post-incumbent challenger elected in 200 years. Now, what do I mean by post-incumbent challenger? Well, including the 2016 election, there have been a total of 17 presidential elections in American history in which no incumbent was on the ballot, but we were succeeding a two-term president. No incumbent on the ballot, but we're succeeding a two-term president. So George H.W. Bush in 1988 would be an example of a non-incumbent succeeding a two-term incumbent. But Harry Truman wouldn't have been an example of this because he had actually continued part of FDR's term. Completely different circumstance. We've had 17 circumstances where we had a two-term incumbent and then we had an election with no incumbent on the ballot. In the prior 16, before you get to 2016, there was a very clear trend in both the popular and in the Electoral College vote. And that trend was there was always a significant shift in the vote away from the party in power and to the party out of power. History in America tells us that after you add a two-term incumbent and you've got an open contest to succeed him, the party out of power tends to benefit tremendously. How big of a swing? Well, if you look at the 16 post-incumbent elections over the course of our history, it has been a shift of roughly 10 percentage points in the popular vote toward the party that was out of power. Now, the United States has been around for quite some time. If we wanted to look at only those elections that have taken place since, say, the Civil War, it's been a smaller but still significant 6 percentage point shift toward the party that was out of power. So what does that mean for us looking at 2016 if we had a generic Democrat and a generic Republican? Well, Barack Obama had won the popular vote with 51% of the vote in 2012. Mitt Romney had won 47% of the vote. A 6-point shift in favor of the party out of power would have told us that in a hypothetical matchup in 2010, the Republican should have won 53% of the vote. The Democrat should have won 45% of the vote. Hillary Clinton well outperformed what history would have predicted. Donald Trump well underperformed what history would have predicted. Hillary Clinton received 48% of the vote, not 45%. Donald Trump received 46% of the vote, not 53%. In a broader context, Trump also ran poorly compared to other Republicans on the ballot, something that hasn't been talked about a lot. In total, Republican candidates for the House of Representatives in 2016 won the popular vote. They received a plurality of the popular vote by nearly 1.4 million votes, getting 49% of the vote to the Democrats, 46% of the vote. Republicans won the popular vote running for the House. And when you look at states where there were contested Senate races, in nearly every state, Donald Trump ran behind the Republican Senate candidate. He didn't do as well as the rest of his party did down ballot. And then one final statistic to suggest that it wasn't actually that impressive in a historical context. Of the 54 presidential elections that have been held in the U.S. since 1804, Trump's share of the electoral vote ranked 44th in size. What this means is there have only been 10 presidential elections that have produced a winner with a smaller share of the electoral vote. Now, does any of that take away from the fact that he won? Of course not. What that suggests to me is the fact that he did underperform relative to other post-incumbent challengers, coupled with the fact that Clinton outperformed where you would have expected for her, suggests that Donald Trump's many flaws that the pundits pointed to often did in fact hurt him. Whether it was the Access Hollywood tape that revealed incredibly lewd behavior, his frequent attacks on women, his Twitter temper tantrums that he was sort of prone to have from time to time, it absolutely suggests that that had an impact on him. But it wasn't an impact enough to overcome where the mood of the electorate was or what history tells us happens after we've had 2 terms of one party in power. It just wasn't enough to overcome that. Trump won in the end by winning 3 of the 4 states that were decided by less than 1 percentage point. Michigan, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. He carried all except for New Hampshire. And New Hampshire, he barely lost. But it was close across those states. Collectively, if you were to look at Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and across those 3 states, take 40,000 people who voted for Trump and instead have them vote for Clinton, she's the president, and he's not. That is an incredibly close election in the United States, again, suggesting that the polls didn't get it wrong. It was close. So the race was just that close for Clinton, but history tells us it shouldn't have been. She should have lost in a landslide, at least according to history. Now, in every presidential election, there is a tendency among scholars and pundits to ask whether or not the outcome had resulted in some dramatic reordering of the political establishment. I would argue that there's actually no reason to conclude that 2016 was some sort of realignment. In fact, I think 2016 was a somewhat conventional outcome, a predictable outcome even, but the presence of 2 historically unpopular candidates and 1 very unconventional candidate has caused us to think of it as different than that. But I just think that that's wrong. Rather, the size and scope of what happened points not to a realignment, but to a continuation of these occasional populist uprisings that we see when people become angry, they feel forgotten, they believe the government does not represent them, and they react in the only way they can, which is to react against the establishment, regardless of what party label the establishment has in any given election cycle. So 2016 was the manifestation of years, in fact decades, of rising levels of discontent and a growing number of disaffected voters. And in the midst of that discontent entered 2 immensely unpopular candidates. 1, a former senator, a former secretary of state, a former candidate for president, the spouse of a former president, and the heir apparent to an outgoing 2-term president. That candidate was the embodiment of the very political establishment that populist uprisings rail against. The other candidate wasn't. And that's ultimately what mattered for the outcome of the 2016 election. Now, if I may, I'll talk just a little bit about Trump's dealings with Congress, because I don't want to take up too much time. I'd like to have some time to answer questions if you have them. Trump faced a bit of a challenge when he came into office. Yes, he won an election that most folks thought that he was going to lose, but he came into office not really affiliated with the Republican Party. He had no history with the Republican Party. In fact, he had run a hostile takeover of the party through the primary. Many Republicans, especially Republicans in the House, had distanced themselves from him, were not willing to endorse him, did not have a good relationship with him. He won the Electoral College, but he lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes. And from the moment he entered office, his approval rating was well below what is normal for an incoming president, which means he went to Washington and he went to Congress with very little what we call political capital, that thing that a president needs to convince a legislature to work with him. Trump went to Washington with what I call 2 agendas, a reactive agenda and a proactive agenda. The reactive agenda was his promise to go in there and undo Obama's regulatory legacy. Basically, everything that Obama had done with a stroke of a pen, Donald Trump was going to undo. But he then had a very ambitious proactive agenda, which included tax reform, the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, infrastructure reinvestment, school choice legislation, border security, immigration reform, a whole host of things that he said that he was going to accomplish, and in fact promised 12 major bills in his first 100 days, introduced and voted on in Congress. His reactive agenda, he has been relatively successful at. He has used his pen effectively to undo what Barack Obama used his pen to do. We've seen this with the exit from the Paris Climate Agreement. We've seen this with the halting of the Clean Power Plan, which was the comprehensive environmental and energy plan that had been put forward by President Obama. The problem, of course, with that reactive side of things is what a president can do with a pen, Donald Trump has demonstrated another president can undo with a pen, which means that what President Trump has undone with a pen, his successor can redo with a pen. If you want lasting policy change, you need legislation, which means you need Congress. Trump desperately needs Congress. His first big test was the repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act. I don't think I need to tell any of you how that turned out for him. The Affordable Care Act still exists, as it had before he was ever elected. It did not disappear in the first 100 days of his administration. He said it would be gone quickly. No problems. And it's still there. Much of the reason it's still there is because he doesn't have a good relationship with members of his own party. There is not this sense of loyalty between members of his party and the president. In fact, there is a sense that the president really doesn't care about members of his own party. And this has been evidenced through high-profile battles he's had with senators like Mitch McConnell, John McCain, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, and others. When Republicans actually passed an Affordable Care Act repeal bill in May, the president initially praised it. And then the poll numbers came in that showed how unpopular it was. And in a meeting with senators just a month later, he said to them, you know what, that Republican House bill was just mean. You can do better. Well, for Republicans in the House, that message was clear. If what we do is unpopular, he's not going to defend us. He's going to throw us under the bus. He followed that up with a weeks-long attack on his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who had been his earliest supporter and one of his most vocal advocates. A former member of the Senate who many senators knew and respected well. When they saw him turn on Jeff Sessions, there was a sense. He has no loyalty to us. Donald Trump wants us to be loyal to him, but he does not reciprocate that loyalty. Well, if you're a president and you are asking members of your party to cast votes that may not be popular, those members of your party have to know and believe that you have their back. And right now, there is absolutely nothing to indicate that level of trust among the president and members of his own party in Congress. And it has resulted in the high-profile defeats of the Affordable Care Act repeal and replace. Trump hasn't helped matters. Whenever the repeal and replace effort in the Senate first failed in July, in the span of 36 hours, Donald Trump took 3 different positions on what they should do next. First, what he said was, what we should do, forget repeal and replace, just repeal it, and then later we'll figure out how to replace it. 10 hours later, he said, no. What we should do is just leave it alone, let it fail, and then we'll rebuild it. And then about 12 hours after that, he said, you know what we really need to do? Republicans need to go out and sell the bill that just failed. That's what we've got to do. That's not the kind of leadership that Congress is looking for from their president to tell them, what are we supposed to do? That problematic relationship with Congress continues to dog President Trump. So we find ourselves at really the end of 9 or 10 months into his presidency. None of the 12 pieces of legislation that he said were going to come up for a vote in the first 100 days ever did. The only piece of legislation that ever came up for a vote was months later, and that was the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which ultimately failed. Now they are trying desperately to get tax reform through. If it does succeed, it will be the only piece of legislation from his 12-package promise that he made in October of 2016 to have voted on in the first 100 days. Now, that doesn't mean he hasn't had some success in Congress. Obviously, he had success getting Neil Gorsuch appointed to the Supreme Court. I would argue, though, that that success was more the success of Mitch McConnell, who convinced every Republican to vote in favor of eliminating the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. If McConnell hadn't been able to unite Republicans to do that, Neil Gorsuch wouldn't have been approved. He's had some success with a rather obscure piece of law called the Congressional Review Act, which allows Congress to repeal regulations that were issued in the waning days of an outgoing administration. Well, okay, but that's relatively low-hanging fruit. If he wants to have lasting change, legislative change, this relationship with Congress needs to become functional. Arguing with members of your own party doesn't get you there. You've got to find a way to work with them. So I would say we've got maybe 3 potential outcomes for the Trump presidency. One is best case scenario. Best case scenario is he repairs this relationship with Congress, starts generating the legislation that he promised to generate, comes to a resolution with North Korea that's to the world's liking, generates some political capital, and moves forward with the missteps of his first year behind him. Puts him in a good place going into 2018. That's best case. Worst case scenario is he continues to have problems in Congress. The Russia investigation continues to be there. Bob Mueller puts forward more indictments that further weaken his presidency. His approval rating continues to fall, and Democrats reclaim the House, or the House and the Senate in 2018, and the next 2 years are nothing but investigations and stalemate. Worst case scenario. And then there is sort of the middle road, which is what we've seen for the past 9 months is what we see for 4 years. A difficult and strained relation with Congress, some occasional legislative successes, but mainly a president who governs by the use of his pen and executive action. I think with each passing week, the best case scenario becomes more difficult to imagine. That's 2 sections from the book. I've already gone longer than I wanted to go, and I apologize for that. But with that, I close, and I happily will take any questions. I just want to let you know that any question you ask that I don't want to answer, my prepared response is, my co-author wrote that part. Just so you know. Any questions, please? Yeah. I see as the most likely outcome that we have 4 years that look like the last 9 months.
Follow-up to that, how is that not the worst-case scenario?
Well, if you're Trump, the worst-case scenario is that you've lost Congress, which means you won't even get the occasional legislative success. You'll get a party that basically just says, we're not going to work with you on anything, and what we're going to do is spend all of our time investigating you. And that's all that's going to happen. For Trump, that is absolutely a worst-case scenario. And for a country, I think it's a worst-case scenario if you really see adversarial government doing nothing but being adversaries. So I would still see that as worse.
How about adding to that the friction with North Korea and an escalation of that?
But if it escalates, you see that falling into the worst-case scenario, and it probably emboldens Democrats. We're still waiting to see what happens with North Korea. And of course, look, the issue with North Korea is it's the person we're dealing with mainly in North Korea. We knew that his father was someone that you could at least work with. But he isn't, because we don't know what his ultimate objective is. It's very hard to try to stake out a foreign policy when you have no idea what your adversary actually believes in. At least that would be my thinking. I'm an Americanist, not IR, but I would think when you're dealing with someone and you have no idea what they actually want, it's a little bit more difficult to negotiate with them. We're right now going on the assumption that what he doesn't want is to commit suicide. And I don't know if that's necessarily the best way to negotiate, but it's the one thing we feel pretty confident about. He doesn't want to die. So, there you have it. Gives you a good impression of why that making it worse becomes the worst case scenario. Yeah, please.
How did you predict Trump winning the election?
So I didn't, although I had a caveat. The political science department sent out predictions, and all of us predicted a Clinton win. I had a caveat that said, I wouldn't be surprised, though, if Trump pulled out a victory. I thought it would be more narrow in the Electoral College than it was. But, I mean, that was me basing it on the fact that we just had a team win the World Series that nobody ever thought would ever win the World Series. So I thought, hey, anything can happen. Sure, he's going to win it. And I will admit, I feel bad about the fact that I didn't sort of predict the win. And I feel bad about it because my first book, Professor Ferris was nice enough to mention I've written more than one. My first book was nothing but a chronicling of this rise of popular discontent and what it has led voters to do. But for the most part, we only ever really saw it play out in elections that were midterm elections, where turnout tended to be lower. So it just didn't dawn on me that we were going to see it rise to the level of a presidential election and actually determine the outcome. It helped Ross Perot get 18% of the vote, but that's not winning. So it was looking at even my own research and falling more for the punditry side of this argument than the political science part of it.
So say that Trump's presidency for the next 3 years goes on as either a worst case or a no go. Do you predict that voters will feel kind of the opposite, like the pendulum of populism may swing the other way? And
It certainly could happen, although if you look at Trump's rhetoric, Trump has been very effective at the use of his rhetoric to make clear that he's still not the establishment. So if you're angry against the establishment, you're not angry against him. And if you talk to the folks who voted for him, in fact, there was a survey that was out just this past week that found, I think it was 91% of the people who voted for Trump said that they would vote for him again. He continues to speak to their anger. He continues to speak to what they see as the failings in Washington. And many of them, I mean, if you talk to them, believe that the real failure hasn't been Trump, it's been Paul Ryan, it's been Mitch McConnell. The problem is a Congress that won't work with him. You know, never mind that Congress isn't necessarily supposed to work with a president, they're supposed to work together, but his rhetoric has been very effective at keeping his base intact. There was another poll, it's a Washington Post ABC poll that came out this week, asked people, did you vote in 2016 and how did you vote? And among that sample, it was 46 Clinton, 43 Trump, which perfectly mirrored the election. If the election were held today, how would you vote? 40% Trump, 40% Clinton. So Clinton actually lost ground relative to Trump among people who say they voted in 2016. So he's not losing ground with his base. And I think that his rhetoric, there's a method to what you might call his madness. When he goes to Twitter and he makes the statements he makes, or when he holds a campaign rally and he rails against people kneeling during the national anthem, for instance, he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows the voters that he's speaking to because these are the voters that he needs to be motivated to turn out to vote when he runs for re-election in 2020, regardless of whether or not he can point to those legislative accomplishments that you would expect to see from a president.
So you talked about some of the problems we have in Congress lately. With the resignation, well, not the resignation, but the promise not to rerun from Bob Corker and some other senators. Are we likely to see more senators, another wave of people going into retirement? And what, since these senators have said that they're going to be openly critical of Donald Trump, are we likely to see more senators or representatives follow on this path? And how is this going to affect the tax plan? That's not
Well, you know, there is something liberating about deciding that you will not seek re-election. For some reason, people decide that once they're not running for re-election, they can speak their mind, but apparently they can't when they're actually running for election. So you have seen some rather high-profile examples of, especially in the Senate, people announcing that they're not going to run, and they're now sort of unleashing on Donald Trump. In the Senate, it does create a problem for tax reform, but even if you take someone like Jeff Flake, who announced that he wasn't going to run and then had this sort of blistering attack on Trump, if you look at his voting record, his voting record was completely in line with Trump's agenda. He doesn't like Trump's tactics, he doesn't like the way Trump behaves as president, but as far as what he wants to accomplish, the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, tax reform, he absolutely supports it. So I wouldn't see a reason why, just because he's not running, he wouldn't vote for it. The difference being that Flake is also a deficit hawk. So if there is a sense that this tax reform bill blows a hole in the deficit, it's not paid for, the fact that he's not running for re-election may make him feel empowered to vote against it. I certainly think that in the Senate, a very familiar cast of characters is going to be a challenge for this tax bill. And that's going to be John McCain, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski. And it's going to come down to the fact that it's not paid for. You know, that's why and by the way, that's why the repeal of the Affordable Care Act mattered so much to the Republican agenda. The repeal of the Affordable Care Act freed up a lot of money. And that money that would no longer be paid to subsidize health insurance is money that then could fund the tax reform without it blowing a hole in the deficit. Not achieving the repeal of the Affordable Care Act means they're putting forward a tax reform bill that in the first 10 years alone has about $1.5 trillion that they have no idea where the money's coming from. The hope is, well, the economy grows, and if the economy grows, that generates revenue. That's no guarantee. I mean, the past few years have told us economic growth is no guarantee. So it's going to face challenges. But I think in the end, there is this sense that something has to pass. This first year cannot go by without a significant legislative accomplishment. It has to. And if Republicans can't pass a tax cut, then there is a serious problem with the party.
So you mentioned that you're an Americanist, and I
Guilty.
certainly don't want to be the one to pick a subfield fight between the comparativists and the Americanists. But you said that one of the reasons that we got the predictions wrong was that it's because we didn't look to political science. We were looking to punditry. And I would argue that even the political scientists perhaps look too narrowly within political science, right? The Americanists, who are the commentators on MSNBC or what have you, are looking at American politics literature. And I think that even among Americanists, there is still this belief in American exceptionalism. Because leading up to the election, comparativists were publishing articles, were submitting monkey cage pieces, blog posts, and talking about how worried we were about what was happening in America.
Sure, because of course the morning after the election, everybody's talking about, well, we've actually seen this happening all around the world. Brexit being sort of the great example of this. Like, oh, wow, really? So politics takes place elsewhere, and we can learn something from that. I'm not at all going to disagree with you. Although the people who, talk on MSNBC or Fox News or CNN are not political scientists. And most of them, I don't know, have read any meaningful political science research. I mean, they are pundits who tend to be sort of driven, obsessed with polling data. We as a society have become obsessed with polling data, telling us things.
Melissa Harris Perry and others who are.
But yeah, I think you're right. This populist uprising, in fact, we make the point in the book, this is not unique to America. We are seeing this happen throughout the world. So Brexit was in many respects the camel's nose under the tent telling us that this outcome could absolutely happen. But just as folks were convinced, oh, Brexit won't happen, in the end, there's no way that people would actually vote for this. Yeah, they will.
Or even if you accept that there have been, as you've argued, these populist uprisings in America over time, well, we can never be quite that extreme.
Sure. Well, of course. There's a moderating force within American politics. Right, I get you. Although, if I have to accept that there are other fields other than, Americanism, I'll grant you've made a valid point.
So it sounds like great things. 66% reporting, Northern leads almost 52% to 47%.
Okay.
Do you think that the sort of focus on the special congressional elections and the Virginia gubernatorial elections are legitimate referendums? Or do you think this is more country than just
So,
especially with the demographic change?
we're obsessed. We're always looking for that canary in the coal mine that tells us this is what's going to happen. And if you look at, say, 2013 Virginia when McAuliffe won, well, look, actually Democrats are doing pretty well. And then 2014 comes along and Republicans gain even more seats in the House and they win back control of the Senate. We obsess too much over these individual elections and try to, from them, discern a larger pattern. Virginia went from being a traditionally Democratic state to a traditionally Republican state to now a purple state, but that has recently been voting Democratic statewide. In that respect, with the Democratic president, with the Republican president, it shouldn't surprise us that Northam would win. Not at all. But you've got to look for anything that gives you something to talk about the next morning, because you got 24 hours of the news cycle to fill. So, what did this mean? And tomorrow, I guarantee you, if Northam wins, what we're going to hear is, this is proof that Donald Trump's presidency is in grave danger. 2018 has already been lost by the Republicans because of this. And, if it had gone the other way, they'd be waking up in the morning and say, this is proof that the Democratic strategy against Donald Trump has failed and they don't know what to do. They're trying to find a narrative that fits a result. That, in many respects, may well just be, it's Virginia. Ed Gillespie isn't a particularly good candidate, didn't run a particularly good campaign, and Ralph Northam was a very moderate Democrat. that had pretty decent appeal among independent voters. You can actually make a case for why it just matters for Virginia. Notice nobody's going to be talking about whether or not New Jersey means anything. And the reason nobody's going to be talking about New Jersey is because everybody knows. What's happening in New Jersey is Chris Christie completely destroying the Republican brand in the state of New Jersey for a generation. So why bother reading anything into it? So we can look at New Jersey and say, that's all Chris Christie casting a shadow over everything. But then we'll go to Virginia and say, but here, this really tells us something. Yeah, we just get caught up in these individual data points, sometimes to our detriment.
So with the talk of elections just being kind of commentary, there is an election coming up in about a month that people have been talking about, Democrats having an outside chance at, and that's the Alabama special election. I was wondering if you thought that by some long shot, the Democrat does win in that election, and if congressional Republicans start thinking about getting Trump out.
It would surprise me to see a Democrat win in Alabama, given where Alabama has gone politically. Even a controversial candidate, that controversial candidate, I think, is still more in tune with where Alabama voters are than the Democrat who is running against him. If you would see some sort of upset. Of course, this is going to cause concern for Republicans running for re-election. It's obvious right now that Republicans are concerned. That's why we're seeing the retirement announcements that we're seeing. There were another list of retirement announcements today. Lobiondo, a Republican from New Jersey, was considered to be a relatively safe bet for re-election, but has decided not going to run again in New Jersey without him on the ticket. Actually becomes a likely Democratic pickup. There are signals that there are Republicans who are concerned that they won't be able to get through the 2018 cycle, and they're just retiring. For historical context, we saw Democrats doing this in 1993 and in 94 leading up to that election. They saw the political winds and decided to basically get out of town. It hasn't hit a critical mass yet, but there's at least some indication that Republicans are worried about 2018.
So on that note, what is the significance of what Steve Bannon is doing? Is there historical context?
No, we don't know. We really don't know what's going to happen with Bannon deciding to take on the establishment and looking for people to challenge Republican incumbents. It depends. I mean, if he challenges a Republican incumbent in a reliably red state like, say, Alabama, in the end, it doesn't make a difference with regard to who's in power. The real danger, and I think that the real thing that Republicans are worried about, is that Bannon challenges a Republican incumbent in a swing state, and it winds up being a Republican then, non-incumbent, but who is well outside of what you would call the mainstream, that makes that state a likely pickup for Democrats. That's where the real concern is. So since we have not seen this kind of sort of challenge at that level before, other than Trump challenging from within in 2016, we don't know what the impact is going to be. We can't really predict what the impact will be. We can't predict at this point how successful he's going to be in trying to recruit these folks. But if you're Republicans, you were looking at the 2018 election and the Senate map and realizing that the 2018 Senate map looks really good for Republicans. There are a lot of Democrats up for re-election. It is completely in, say, all things being equal world, it wouldn't have been outside the realm of possibility for Republicans to actually achieve 60 votes in the Senate because of the map that they're facing. If their incumbents in swing states are replaced by much more conservative candidates, then suddenly they are defending themselves in places they didn't think they were defending themselves, instead of looking for ways to expand their map. If someone is nominated to challenge an incumbent Democrat in a state that isn't a red state, and the Bannon forces, nominate someone who is well outside of the mainstream, a little bit more to the right, it makes that challenge much more difficult. But how successful he's going to be, we just don't know yet. I mean, and this is still early in this process for him to have decided to do this. And whether or not Donald Trump ultimately decides that he wants to go all in with Bannon doing this is still undecided, because if you're Donald Trump, the last thing you want is for Democrats to win the Senate, because then you can't even get nominees confirmed. And, we've got a few members of the Supreme Court that are kind of old. And if you're Donald Trump, you're looking at the court and you're thinking, wow, I might actually get a chance to put 2 more people on that court. Well, not if Democrats reclaim the Senate, Because you're basically going to have them tell you, hey, guess what? We're just not going to hold any hearings. The American people are going to decide this, and the next election will determine who gets to put somebody on the court. He doesn't want that to happen.